The rain felt like icy needles on my skin, mirroring the coldness that had settled deep within my bones. The mansion, once a symbol of our shared dreams, now loomed over me, a monument to my shattered reality. Inside, I could hear the faint clinking of glasses, the muffled sounds of laughter, their celebration of my downfall. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything. But they were wrong. They had only awakened a force they couldn't comprehend. If you have a sister who means the world to you, subscribe now. The day my husband James decided to obliterate me was the day I stopped believing in fairy tales. We were supposed to be partners, a team, building an empire together. Instead, he convened a meeting, a formal, sterile affair in our own dining room, and laid out his terms. He wanted everything. The house, the cars, the business we had built from the ground up. Every last asset meticulously listed and tallied, as if my contributions were nothing more than a rounding error. He spoke of irreconcilable differences, clichés that dripped with insincerity, while his mother, Margaret, sat beside him, a smug expression plastered on her face. My closest friend Sarah was also there, her eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding my gaze. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just James, it was the people I had considered my family, my confidants, all united against me. I was Skylar, and in that moment I felt utterly erased. Underestimated. They saw me as a trophy wife, a pretty face who had simply lucked into wealth and success, conveniently forgetting the countless hours I had poured into the business, the sacrifices I had made, the ideas I had brought to the table. They believed I was weak, incapable of fighting back. They couldn't have been more wrong. The pain was a catalyst, forging a resolve I never knew I possessed. While they toasted to their victory, I retreated into the shadows, silently gathering information, documenting every injustice, every hidden asset, every shady deal they thought I was too naive to understand. Anger, grief, humiliation, I channeled it all, transforming those raw emotions into a laser-focused determination. This wasn't just about money or possessions. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my power. They wanted to rewrite our history, to paint me as a villain in my own story. I would not let them. The person I trusted most was one of them. Sarah, my supposed best friend, had been secretly feeding James information for months, undermining my decisions, subtly poisoning the well. I discovered a series of encrypted messages on James's computer, carefully concealed but not carefully enough. Each message was a dagger, twisting in the wound of our friendship. She knew my vulnerabilities, my insecurities, my dreams, and she used them all against me. The realization was sickening, a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. But beneath the pain, a cold fury began to simmer. They had underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my capacity for righteous retribution. They would soon learn the true meaning of regret. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing anxiety, a constant knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford, the nights filled with replays of their betrayal, the mornings greeted by a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. Every room in the mansion held a memory, each photograph a painful reminder of what I had lost. I tried to reason with James, to appeal to the man I thought I knew, the man I had built a life with. I presented him with meticulously documented evidence of my contributions to the business, the late nights, the strategic decisions, the innovative ideas that had fueled our success. I reminded him of our vows, the promises we had made to support and cherish each other through good times and bad. But his eyes remained cold, his expression unchanging, as if he were listening to a stranger. Margaret, ever present, would interject with thinly veiled insults, questioning my intelligence, my worth, my very right to be there. Sarah, feigning sympathy, would offer platitudes that rang hollow, her every word a carefully calculated deception. Their united front was impenetrable, their resolve unwavering. They had constructed a narrative in which I was the villain, a gold-digging opportunist who had overstayed her welcome, and they were determined to make that narrative a reality. Desperate, I sought legal counsel, hoping to find some recourse, some way to protect myself from their ruthless assault. But James had already preemptively hired the best lawyers in the city, effectively locking me out of any meaningful representation. The few attorneys who were willing to take my case painted a bleak picture, warning me of a protracted legal battle, a costly and emotionally draining process with an uncertain outcome. They advised me to settle, to accept their terms and move on with my life. But settling was tantamount to admitting defeat, to validating their lies, to surrendering my future. I refused to be silenced. I began to meticulously document every interaction, every conversation, every transaction, creating a digital paper trail that would expose their deceit. I spent hours poring over financial records, uncovering hidden accounts, offshore investments, and a web of fraudulent activities that implicated not only James but also Margaret and Sarah. The more I dug, the more I realized the depth of their depravity, the extent of their conspiracy. This wasn't just about greed. It was about control, about power, about erasing me from the narrative of their success. They believed they were untouchable, that their wealth and connections would shield them from any consequences. They underestimated the power of a woman scorned, a woman armed with the truth. The weight of the injustice pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me. The sleepless nights continued, the anxiety intensified, the sense of isolation grew. Yet, with each new discovery, with each piece of evidence I unearthed, my resolve hardened. They had lit a fire within me, a burning desire for justice that would not be extinguished. I attempted to reach out to James's siblings, hoping to find an ally within his family, someone who would see through Margaret's manipulations and recognize the truth. But they had all been effectively neutralized, either through financial incentives or outright intimidation. Margaret held a tight grip on the family's purse strings, and anyone who dared to question her authority was swiftly ostracized. I realized I was completely alone, with no one to turn to but myself. The isolation was crushing, but it also fueled my determination. If they wanted a war, I would give them a war. A war fought on my terms, a war waged with intelligence, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to exposing their lies. I started to act the part of the defeated wife, the heartbroken victim, playing into their expectations, lulling them into a false sense of security. I allowed them to believe they had broken me, that I was on the verge of giving up. But beneath the surface, I was meticulously planning my next move, carefully positioning myself to strike when they least expected it. My days were spent gathering information, my nights spent strategizing, transforming my grief and anger into a weapon. They had underestimated my strength, my resilience, and my capacity for revenge. They were about to learn that crossing me was the biggest mistake they had ever made. The feeling of iciness turned into determination. I was coming for everything. The day they finally moved to take the business was the day I truly understood what being alone meant. I arrived at the office, a place I had poured my heart and soul into for years, only to find my access card deactivated. Security guards, their faces grim, stood at the entrance, barring my way. James's lawyer, a shark in a suit, emerged, a smug smile plastered on his face. He presented me with a restraining order, a document riddled with lies and distortions, accusing me of harassment, of endangering the company's assets, of being mentally unstable. The accusations were absurd, baseless, but they were enough to keep me away, to sever my connection to the business I had helped build. As I stood there, humiliated and defeated, watching my colleagues file past, their eyes averted, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear, I felt a profound sense of loss. It wasn't just the business, it was the relationships, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that had been ripped away from me. The world I had known had crumbled around me, leaving me standing amidst the ruins. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was finished. But they were wrong. That day, standing in the rain, locked out of my own company, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, the betrayal still raw, but beneath it, a new feeling began to emerge. A cold, unwavering determination. I would not let them win. I would not let them erase me from my own story. I would fight back, not with anger or emotion, but with intelligence, strategy, and an unyielding resolve. This was no longer just about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about exposing their lies, their deceit, their corruption. It was about justice. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with their triumph. James and Margaret moved about with an air of smug satisfaction, while Sarah, ever the chameleon, offered me insincere condolences, her eyes betraying a flicker of something akin to fear. I played my part, the defeated wife, the heartbroken victim, retreating into my shell, avoiding confrontation. But inside, I was seething, meticulously cataloging their every move, their every word, their every weakness. I spent hours in my study, ostensibly working on my personal projects, but in reality, I was building my case, gathering evidence, uncovering their secrets. I discovered a hidden server in the basement, a repository of incriminating documents, emails, and financial records that exposed their fraudulent activities in excruciating detail. They had been siphoning money from the company for years, laundering it through offshore accounts, using it to fund their lavish lifestyles. The extent of their greed was staggering, their disregard for the law breathtaking, and they had thought they could get away with it. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I was too naive, too trusting, too preoccupied with my trophy wife duties to notice what they were doing. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The weight of their betrayal was a constant companion, a heavy cloak that I carried with me everywhere. The sleepless nights continued, the anxiety gnawed at me, but I refused to succumb to despair. I would use their arrogance against them, their belief in their own invincibility as their undoing. I began to meticulously plan my revenge, a carefully orchestrated campaign to expose their lies, dismantle their empire, and reclaim my life. One evening, I overheard James and Sarah arguing in the library. Their voices, usually so carefully modulated, were raised in anger, their words laced with bitterness and recrimination. I pressed my ear against the door, listening intently, piecing together the fragments of their conversation. It became clear that their alliance was crumbling, that their carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Sarah was demanding a larger share of the spoils, accusing James of betraying her, of using her for his own purposes. James, in turn, was dismissing her claims, reminding her of her role in his scheme, threatening to expose her complicity if she didn't remain silent. Their argument escalated, their voices rising to a fever pitch, until suddenly there was a crash followed by a chilling silence. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, then cautiously opened the door. The scene that greeted me was shocking. Sarah lay on the floor, unmoving, a crimson stain spreading across the Persian rug. James stood over her, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of fear and desperation. "I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It was an accident." I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to turn the tables on them, to expose their lies and reclaim my power. I knew I had to act quickly, decisively, before James could concoct a story, before he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, and stepped into the room. The game had changed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about survival. Their biggest weakness, they thought they were untouchable. I forced myself to remain calm, my mind racing to assess the situation. James was clearly panicked, but he was still dangerous. He would try to manipulate me, to convince me to help him cover up his actions. I couldn't let that happen. "Call the authorities, James," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Tell them everything." He stared at me, his eyes pleading. "You don't understand, Skylar. This will ruin me. It will ruin us both." "There is no us, James," I replied, my voice cold. "That ended a long time ago. And as for ruining you, you did that yourself." He took a step towards me, his expression desperate. "Please, Skylar, I'm begging you, just give me a chance to explain." I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I don't want to hear your explanations, James. I want you to face the consequences of your actions." I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. "I'm calling the police." He lunged at me, grabbing my wrist, trying to wrestle the phone from my grasp. "Don't do this, Skylar, you'll regret it." I struggled against him, my adrenaline surging. "Get off me, James." I managed to break free, stumbling backwards, putting some distance between us. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. I knew I had to get out of there to protect myself, to ensure that he couldn't silence me. "This isn't over, Skylar," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll pay for this." I didn't respond, turning and fleeing from the library, leaving him standing over Sarah's motionless body. My first priority was to secure the hidden server in the basement, the repository of incriminating evidence that could expose their entire operation. I knew James would try to destroy it, to eliminate any trace of his crimes. I raced to the basement, my heart pounding, my mind focused on the task at hand. I reached the server room, quickly accessing the system, downloading all the data onto an encrypted hard drive. I then wiped the server clean, erasing every file, every record, leaving no trace of its existence. As I was finishing up, I heard footsteps approaching. James was coming. I quickly disconnected the hard drive, concealing it in my purse, and turned to face him. He entered the room, his expression grim. "What are you doing here, Skylar?" he asked, his voice tight. "Just tidying up," I replied, feigning innocence. "I thought I'd organize some of the files." He didn't believe me, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Don't play games with me, Skylar. I know what you're up to." "I have no idea what you're talking about, James," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on? What happened to Sarah?" He hesitated for a moment, then his face hardened. "She had an accident," he said, his voice flat. "A terrible accident." "An accident that involved you, James," I pressed, watching his reaction closely. He didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. I knew I had him. I had seen the fear in his eyes, the guilt on his face. He was trapped, and he knew it. "I think you should call the authorities, James," I said, my voice firm. "Tell them about this accident. Tell them everything." He glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think you've won, Skylar," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But this is just the beginning. I'll make you pay for this. You'll regret ever crossing me." "We'll see about that, James," I replied, my voice unwavering. "We'll see about that." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the server room, his world crumbling around him. Now that I had secured the evidence and alerted the authorities, I needed to ensure my own safety. I knew James was capable of anything, that he would stop at nothing to protect himself and his empire. I couldn't stay in the mansion, it was no longer safe. I packed a bag, grabbing essential documents, cash, and the encrypted hard drive, and slipped out of the house unnoticed. I drove to a prearranged safe house, a discreet apartment I had secured weeks earlier, anticipating just such a scenario. It was sparsely furnished, but it was secure, equipped with state-of-the-art security systems and surveillance equipment. I needed to lay low to avoid detection, while I finalized my plan to expose their crimes. I spent the next few days poring over the evidence, meticulously organizing the documents, emails, and financial records, building an airtight case against James, Margaret, and their co-conspirators. I contacted a forensic accountant, a trusted professional I had vetted thoroughly, and tasked him with analyzing the financial data, tracing the flow of funds, and uncovering the full extent of their fraudulent activities. I also reached out to a private investigator, a former law enforcement officer with extensive experience in white-collar crime, and hired him to gather additional evidence, to corroborate my findings, and to identify any potential witnesses. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed a team of experts, professionals who could help me navigate the complex legal and financial landscape, who could protect me from their retaliation, and who could ensure that justice was served. I also knew that I needed to control the narrative, to get my story out to the public before James and Margaret could spin their own version of events. I contacted a journalist, a respected investigative reporter with a reputation for integrity and a commitment to uncovering the truth. I shared my story with her, providing her with copies of the evidence, and convinced her to write an exposé to expose their crimes to the world. She was initially hesitant, wary of the potential legal ramifications, but after reviewing the evidence, she was convinced of the veracity of my claims. She agreed to publish the story, but only after I had provided her with irrefutable proof, evidence that would withstand any legal challenge. I worked tirelessly with her, providing her with additional documents, arranging interviews with witnesses, and helping her to piece together the complex puzzle of their deceit. I knew this was a risky move, that it could expose me to further danger, but I was willing to take the risk. I believed that the truth was my most powerful weapon, that by exposing their lies to the world, I could dismantle their empire and reclaim my life. I also installed multiple hidden cameras around the mansion before I left, knowing that James and Margaret would be discussing their next moves, their plans to cover up their crimes. I needed to capture those conversations, to document their admissions of guilt, to use their own words against them. The cameras were strategically placed in the library, the living room, and the master bedroom, capturing both audio and video. I accessed the camera feeds remotely, monitoring their every move, recording their every word. I was building a comprehensive record of their crimes, a digital dossier that would leave no doubt of their guilt. The anticipation was almost unbearable, the feeling of waiting for the storm to break, knowing that when it did, it would be devastating. But I was ready. I was prepared. I was armed with the truth. The exact day they tried to end me, I exposed the truth. The hidden cameras were my eyes and ears, feeding me a constant stream of information, revealing their desperation, their paranoia, their unraveling. I watched as James and Margaret circled each other like predators, their alliance strained to the breaking point by Sarah's sudden passing and the looming threat of exposure. They knew the authorities were investigating, that their every move was being scrutinized, and they were growing increasingly frantic, their carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of their lies. One afternoon, I was reviewing the camera footage when I saw something that made my blood run cold. James and Margaret were in the library, arguing heatedly, their voices barely above a whisper. James was packing back and forth, his face contorted with rage, while Margaret sat rigidly in a chair, her expression a mask of icy calm. I leaned closer to the screen, straining to hear their words. "We have to do something about Skylar," James hissed, his voice laced with venom. "She knows too much. She's going to destroy us." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes gleaming with a chilling resolve. "I agree," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She's a loose end, we need to tie it up." My heart pounded in my chest. They were planning to get rid of me. They were going to try to silence me permanently. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. I knew I had to act quickly, to protect myself, to turn their plan against them. I continued to watch the footage, my mind racing, trying to anticipate their next move. James stopped packing and turned to Margaret, his expression hardening. "I have a plan," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We'll lure her back to the mansion. We'll make her think we want to negotiate to offer her a settlement, and then we'll take care of her." Margaret nodded again, a cruel smile spreading across her lips. "Excellent," she said. "I'll arrange everything." I knew I was walking into a trap, that they were planning to end me, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to confront them, to expose their lies, to reclaim my power. I decided to play along, to lure them into a false sense of security, to use their arrogance against them. I contacted James and Margaret through a lawyer, suggesting a meeting at the mansion to discuss a potential settlement. They were ecstatic, eager to seize what they thought was their chance to silence me. They agreed to the meeting immediately, setting a date for the following week. I spent the next few days meticulously preparing for the confrontation. I reviewed the evidence, ensuring that everything was in order, that I had all the necessary documents and recordings to expose their crimes. I also worked with the private investigator and the forensic accountant, finalizing their reports, coordinating their testimony, ensuring that they were ready to present their findings to the authorities. And I installed even more hidden cameras throughout the mansion, turning it into a digital fortress, capturing every angle, every conversation, every incriminating detail. I wanted to ensure that there was no doubt of their guilt, that they couldn't deny their crimes, that they couldn't escape justice. The day of the meeting arrived, and I drove to the mansion, my heart pounding, my senses on high alert. I knew I was walking into a lion's den, that I was facing grave danger, but I was determined to see this through, to bring them to justice, to reclaim my life. As I approached the mansion, I noticed that something was off. The security gates were open, the grounds were deserted, and there was an eerie silence hanging in the air. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over me, but I pushed it aside, steeling my nerves, and drove through the gates. I parked the car in the driveway and stepped out, taking a deep breath, preparing myself for what was to come. As I walked towards the front door, I noticed that it was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open intentionally. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, but then I heard a voice from inside the house. "Skylar," James called out, his voice smooth and deceptively welcoming. "We've been expecting you, come in, let's talk." I hesitated for a moment, then cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark and silent, the air heavy with anticipation. I walked into the living room where James and Margaret were waiting for me, their faces etched with a mixture of nervousness and malice. "Skylar," James said, his voice still smooth but with a hint of steel beneath. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate you giving us the opportunity to resolve this amicably." I looked at them, my eyes narrowed, my senses on high alert. "I'm not here to be amicable, James," I said, my voice cold. "I'm here to expose your crimes, to bring you to justice." Margaret scoffed, her eyes filled with contempt. "You think you can take us down, Skylar," she said. "You're just a naive little girl, you have no idea what you're up against." "I know exactly what I'm up against," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I'm up against a pair of greedy, corrupt individuals who think they can get away with anything. But you're wrong, your time is up." James stepped forward, his expression hardening. "That's enough, Skylar," he said, his voice menacing. "We offered you a chance to walk away from this, but you refused. Now you're going to pay the price." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver pistol, pointing it directly at me. My blood ran cold. This was it. They were going to end me. But I refused to show fear. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on James, my mind racing, searching for a way out. "You're making a mistake, James," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. "This isn't going to solve anything. It's only going to make things worse." Margaret laughed, a cruel, chilling sound that echoed through the room. "It's already too late for that, Skylar," she said. "The only mistake we made was underestimating you. But we won't make that mistake again." James cocked the pistol, the sound echoing in the silence. "Any last words, Skylar?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, preparing myself for the inevitable. "I hope you like orange," I said, a smirk playing on my lips. James looked confused, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he said. But before I could answer, the front door burst open and a SWAT team stormed into the room, their weapons drawn, their voices shouting commands. "Police, freeze, don't move." James and Margaret stared in shock, their faces a mixture of disbelief and terror. They had been outsmarted, they had been trapped, and their world was about to come crashing down around them. As the police swarmed the room, handcuffing James and Margaret, I couldn't help but smile. My plan had worked. My revenge was complete. The exact day they tried to end me, I exposed the truth. The courtroom was a spectacle. Every major news outlet was there. James and Margaret sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale, their bodies slumped. The evidence I had meticulously gathered, the hidden camera footage, the financial records, the testimonies of the forensic accountant and the private investigator, it was all presented with brutal precision. The journalist I had contacted had published her exposé, and the public outcry was deafening. Their empire, built on lies and deceit, was crumbling before their eyes. The prosecutor played the hidden camera footage where they discussed their plans. You could hear a pin drop. The moment James pointed the pistol at me was replayed over and over, each time met with gasps from the gallery. The forensic accountant detailed the elaborate schemes they used to funnel money into offshore accounts. The private investigator presented evidence of their attempts to silence anyone who threatened them. It was a symphony of destruction, orchestrated to perfection. James tried to deny everything, to claim that he was framed, that I was a scorned woman seeking revenge. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his lies were transparent. Margaret, once so composed and icy, broke down on the stand, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for mercy. But there was no mercy to be had. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced James and Margaret to the maximum penalty. As the bailiffs led them away, their eyes met mine. There was no hatred, no anger, only a hollow emptiness. The life they knew was over. Their reputation was ruined. Their wealth was gone. They had lost everything. Even their relationship with each other was fractured beyond repair. As the news of their sentencing spread, the other co-conspirators began to turn on each other, scrambling to save themselves, pointing fingers, making deals with the authorities. Their criminal enterprise imploded, leaving a trail of shattered lives and ruined careers in its wake. Sarah's family finally got the answers they deserved, the truth about her accident brought to light. It was a bittersweet victory, but it brought them a measure of closure, a sense that justice had finally been served. I watched it all unfold from a distance, from the safety of my new life, a life free from their manipulation and control. I had reclaimed my power, my agency, my sense of self. The scars of their betrayal would always be there, but they would no longer define me. They lost everything. I just smiled. In the aftermath, I found myself reflecting on the events that had led me to this point. The betrayal, the pain, the relentless pursuit of justice. It had been a long and arduous journey, one that had tested me to my limits. I had been forced to confront the darkest parts of myself, to embrace a side of me I never knew existed. And while I had emerged victorious, I had also lost something along the way: my innocence, my naivete, my unwavering trust in others. Some might say that revenge is a dish best served cold. Some might say that it's a destructive force that consumes those who seek it. But I disagree. Revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. It's a primal instinct, a response to injustice, a way to reclaim what has been stolen. It's a way to send a message to show the world that you will not be a victim, that you will not be silenced, that you will fight back. And sometimes that's the only way to survive, the only way to heal, the only way to find peace. I rebuilt my life, stronger and wiser, forever changed by the fire I had walked through. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more justice.